this is going to be an interesting video because 7 years ago, I reviewed iMeet's thread from iCarly. And to tell you the truth, that video itself was mainly my earlier years of experiencing reviewing content on YouTube, to the point that 7 years later, I've got experience in judging of how my perspective towards that review I made 7 years ago has changed. I was planning on revisiting that episode in the future, and I did earlier in 2022, but I scrapped that because it wasn't better. In fact, I wasn't prepared when I made that review in early 2022. And I'm planning to do more of these revisiteds in the future, but don't expect me to do a lot, considering that I've only have a couple or a few to go back to, since that my perspective back then has changed over time. And when it comes to this episode, with it still being one of the worst episodes for iCarly, I'm gonna be really honest with you that the time that this episode aired was ahead of its time, yeah, but nowadays, with the revival out being in its 3rd season, I'm gonna be real with you that this episode just feels really pale in comparison of the revival. Though granted, I didn't watch a lot from the revival after stopping at seasons 2, but believe me when I say this, what I've seen is more than enough. I'm just gonna be real with you that out of all the episodes that I revisited on rewatch from iCarly, this still is the least that I go back to, and yet at the same time, I still have new knowledge of it after getting more information after my years on the internet. Because this episode is way ahead of its time on a person's opinion being instantly bashed on due to the creator quitting or doing something terrible in order to do publicity. But at the same time, when it comes to the publicity that has been exposed towards the end, when Fred showed the iCarly game involving the web ratings or the web traffic in general, it doesn't change the fact that the Fred character that Lucas made hasn't aged well, since that Lucas doesn't play that character anymore and he's focusing on being himself in his own YouTube channel. I want to point out that Dan Schneider wrote this episode, and with the knowledge that he had on making this episode ahead of time, it doesn't change the fact that he tries way too hard to make the Fred character as a content creator celebrity at most. Which, honestly, watching the Fred videos even after a decade and a half, it's not really the case. Like, I understand that Dan Schneider is really the most controversial person when it comes to Nickelodeon, but at the same time, people have been discrediting of how smart Dan Schneider is. Like, I understand that he's a manipulator and he can do terrible things, and while I understand that his writing skills in this episode is somewhat on point when it comes to taking the situation seriously, I still cannot deny on the fact that he made this episode good. In fact, it's just really difficult for me to find any enjoyment from this episode, considering that he is trying way too hard, despite the fact that he is trying to make this episode way ahead of its time. Believe me when I say this, is that this episode has been talked about by basically everyone, and with a few people who actually found this episode good is mainly the fact that it talks about internet culture, on the fact that this episode is way ahead of its time. And the thing is that the reason onto why that some people enjoy this episode is that despite the fact that people actually enjoy Freddy getting beaten up by Sam, or sometimes getting slightly tortured by some characters, it really feels like that they see this episode a lot more closely on being way more realistic than it needed to be. Though then again, when it comes to other positives, I felt like that they kind of took this element and make the iCarly situation of the iCarly killing Fred a lot more less painful, considering that if the web traffic is true involving the iCarly fans really enjoying iCarly and siding with iCarly the most, it's just really weird to think that we don't get to see the people siding with the iCarly gang onto thinking that Fred's opinion is really valid and, to be perfectly honest, not really insulting. That's literally the problem, is the fact that it just focused the negative side way too much, rather than having positive sides on having an opinion involving Freddy not enjoying Fred's videos. Here's what I mean. As much as I sympathize Freddy in this, the reason why he isn't being tormented physically when it comes to mentally is because he's emotionless in this show. In I Kiss, he was actually emotional, but in this and everything after and before I Kiss, he's emotionless, which is a problem that people don't bring up when it comes to Freddy's character in this. While I understand that people were focusing on the torment that Freddy goes through, it doesn't change the fact that Freddy is emotionless in this entire episode. Even when Sam beats him up physically towards the end, even if it may be forced emotions and emotional torment and trauma, it doesn't change the fact that he is just fine seconds later. And for me personally, the fact that it just made me more convinced on the fact that they're just hammering in on the different opinion being unpopular in comparison to popular opinions. I found most of this really less focused and mainly focusing on the popular opinion being superior over the unpopular opinion. But even if I had the same opinions in the past, it doesn't change the fact that Freddy is unprepared for any of this. Like, he isn't prepared to be in a feud with Fred, which Nickelodeon stated in one of the videos involving this episode. Well, Freddy is in a feud with Fred, and I'm sorry, but it really shows that Nickelodeon just doesn't take anything seriously whenever they do these types of stuff. When it comes to re-uploading material that they did in a decade ago, well, they just try to mix things up in order to make things better, but at the end of the day, it just makes things worse. It just made me convinced that they just didn't know what to do with the other characters like Carly or Sam if they have a different opinion over a popular opinion. And with most of the information like neverwatchicarly.com or any of that type of stuff, maybe it was understandable when it comes to early content back in the late 2000s. I just found most of the stuff mostly outdated, considering that no one will probably make a website involving never watching iCarly or anything else when it comes to boycotting or causing toxicity. Like, I know there are toxicity when it comes to people making posters and other stuff, which is somewhat relatable when it comes to neverwatchicarly.com, but when it comes to making a website, not even close. In fact, it just kind of feels really unrealistic when it comes to nowadays. Yes, I understand that these types of topics may exist nowadays in some shape or form, but whenever I think about this episode involving an unpopular opinion being over-exaggerated to the point that it's the end of the world, well, it's mainly an honest opinion from Freddy. I just don't understand why that this episode is called iMeet Fred when it could have been alternatively different, since that Nickelodeon was advertising this as Fred being on iCarly. Since that Fred is the first person to reach 1 million subscribers, Nickelodeon would have done a lot more better into making this episode differently when it comes to the motivation of the iCarly gang meeting Fred or Lucas for the first time. Like, if Lucas was doing this for publicity, it's difficult to believe that the Nostalgia Critic and the Angry Video Game Nerds had did this type of formula, but they were all in on the whole thing. And they did this before this episode came out. And while those characters or people are not as popular as they were in the past, since that nowadays they're in controversies or just doing what they could in order to move forward with their lives while doing a living, I still feel like those people have been doing news reports or taking photos in this episode were focused on them a lot more than what they're dealing with involving the situation of iCarly and Fred. Because believe me when I say this, I may have been harsh on this and I can understand what they're trying to do in this. It just feels way too over-exaggerated to the point that it just made me convinced that they could have done a much more better news report than what they're doing in this episode. Here's the thing. The ability that Dan Schneider had involving culture wars and with this episode being way ahead of its time, it really feels like that he was focusing those a lot more than focusing on the execution of the story itself. Like, Freddy and the iCarly gang were unprepared for a web war that Fred started, even if it's mainly for publicity, because in all honesty, when you do stuff involving publicity, it's mainly on what Fred or Lucas did in this episode. That's literally the problem that I have, is that he didn't had iCarly be in on this whole gig in the first place. And even if the episode would have been predictable, like the whole Nostalgia Critic versus AVGN war thing, they could have made the appearance of Fred or Lucas himself a lot more better. But considering that Nickelodeon exploited the Fred character that Lucas made when it comes to the 3 movies and a TV series out of it, it really shows that Nickelodeon loved Fred. And just witnessing Fred's treehouse, I was unconvinced when I made my review of it 7 years ago, but thinking about it now, I just find it difficult to believe that Dan Schneider is trying this hard to convince us that Fred is an internet celebrity, even though that he is mainly a character that Lucas made. And considering that Lucas is mainly an internet celebrity of his own, rather than the Fred character, is really saying something. Which really makes this Fred war between iCarly mostly outdated, considering that the Fred character is dead, while iCarly is still going on even in a different direction, but it is still going on in a different capacity, since that Lucas is moving on differently without continuing the Fred character. And since that the main focus of this episode is just centering on how Fred is the best thing on the internet, maybe there's a reason onto why I don't take the haters of Fred or anything else involving the criticisms towards Fred seriously, because it just really feels like that Nickelodeon is just glorifying Fred and just found the character a gold mine for themselves. I'm just saying this right now that the skit towards the end, I didn't find it hilarious, even if it's supposed to be a collab between the iCarly gang. But after witnessing this entire episode, it just really feels like that this collab towards the end just isn't worth it. And I just found the Fred videos way more superior over this. And while yes, I understand that the Fred videos may have been stale, annoying, and mostly outdated when it comes to nowadays, at the same time, the earlier years of YouTube and internet videos were mainly at a time where people are experiencing new things, and YouTube back then just wasn't as it was nowadays. it just really feels like that we just really miss the old days so much that the only good thing that came out involving the Fred videos is how time was simpler back then involving YouTube and the internet. It just really feels like that everything I've seen involving the culture war or cancel culture or any of that type of stuff, it just isn't that good when it comes to this episode, considering that it's way ahead of its time, sure, but at the same time, it's being focused on the wrong elements. And while those elements are still worth exploring, the elements that they've taken out will have made the episode a lot more better. And since that the Spencer bits involving the magic meatball has more comedic value over the main plot's comedic value is really saying something. I don't even know if it's either the fact that I'm really into other topics that are much more worth discussing than this, but the reason why revisiting this episode is mainly important is because I want to express my thoughts on how this entire episode would have been much more better rather than criticizing it for the 1000th time. Because believe me, the only closest way I'm ever going to see this episode is mainly from reactors expressing their opinions on this. Because that's literally the closest I'm ever going to see new people's opinions on this episode, rather than people just expressing the problems of this episode. So in my opinion, my opinions towards this episode has changed after 7 years, but that doesn't mean this episode is good and I didn't enjoy it in the slightest. I just felt like that it would have been a lot more better executed, considering that everything I've witnessed in this episode just seems like nowadays when it comes to cancel culture and all that, there's a lot of toxicity going on the internet. And in comparison to what I've seen from this episode's plot would have been much more better if it was mostly edgy for adults rather than kid-friendly. Because for me personally, whenever I see family-friendly elements involving this, it just doesn't work. It really doesn't. And for me personally, it just really shows that Freddy just isn't the type of character that is suitable for anything else in this episode. Especially the ending where he hugs out Lucas in order to sort out the feud. If anything, the representation involving people like Freddy experiencing this stuff for the first time is mainly them being unprepared, and that's mainly what life is like. Doesn't change the fact that the aftermath of all this would still have a negative impact, considering that the scenario that Freddy is into isn't that severe when it comes to a lot more serious situations. When Lucas himself admitted that he hated this episode, you can really tell that the Fred character is officially history, which really makes this episode difficult to enjoy once you get more information. I'm giving this episode a 1 out of 10. Since I didn't give it a rating when I first reviewed it 7 years ago, I officially give it a rating of a 1 out of 10.